Now we will discuss children's acquisition of syntactic knowledge. Children's acquisition of language is a very dynamic process. Every normal child acquires language in just few years. By 3 to 4 years, children seem to produce the ability, an adult-like ability, to produce and understand language in a multiple manner by generating or coming up with sentences fitting in a specific situation or social context. Chomsky believes that the linguist should be concerned with understanding the gap that is there in terms of looking at what children have come to know about language and what they could have learned from their experiences. Now, in terms of understanding the process of children's language acquisition, you see that once the core construction types are mastered by children, then these constructions become more and more complex with the passage of time, till the time when the child's language approximates that of an adult language in any given situation. Children master the syntax, the sentence structure of their language through exposure and interaction. That interaction which they have with their caregiver or people around them, and notably with no formal tuition. So this comes through interaction. This comes through having some kind of not only interaction but reinforcement that they get from people around them who are their caregiver or their parents or their friends. So no formal tutoring is required as far as understanding of syntactic structure of sentences are concerned. So looking at the process in order to understand the syntactic knowledge, especially with regard to children's acquisition of that, we see that children, they babble, pass through a single and multi-word stage, and then start to produce entire sentence. Now initially, the very initial stage is that of babbling, where they say mama, papa, and then they pass through a single and then sometimes multi-word stage, and then start to produce entire sentence. Two current approaches to the problem of language acquisitions are introduced. One theory of language acquisition follows the theory of universal grammar. Now, considering this particular point, exactly what knowledge base, if any, and what mechanism drive this progression in the language acquisition process is the matter of controversy. So what actually happens here is a matter of controversy, and in terms of a specific or concrete assumption is still to be reached. The challenge for language acquisition researcher is to reveal how this process unfolds. The theory of universal grammar, which is proposed by Chomsky, refers to the fact, and this is also called the generative approach to language acquisition, that the fact that this theory takes as a basic assumption that children are hardwired. They are hardwired with linguistic knowledge that gives them access to structural representation in the absence of experiences. Now, Chomsky proposed that in order to establish how language is represented in mind and brain of speakers, three questions need to be addressed. Number one, what constitutes knowledge of language? Number two, how knowledge of language is acquired? And number three is how knowledge of language is put to use. So the constituents of the knowledge of language, the acquisition, and then the usage of knowledge. So these are the three questions that needs to be addressed or needs to be established in view of Chomsky. In Knowledge of Language, written by Chomsky, he proposed that in order To establish how language is represented, the three questions that are presented. The third is very important in terms of the use, as will become clear that generative and usage-based linguistic theories have different ideas about what constitutes the representation of language and syntax in particular, especially in the mind. Now, the theories also depart in their perspective of whether acquisition of language is guided partly by innate knowledge or whether all knowledge of language is learned through experience. Now, this is something which is widely shared assumption that exposure to language and interaction with speakers in a language community are essential for acquisition to proceed. So this exposure to language and interaction facilitates the acquisition process to further proceed. Speakers of the language, that is basically the caretaker, siblings and so on, also provide linguistic input to the child in the form of utterances and their corresponding meaning. Now this is known as positive input. It refers to the fact that positive input is essential for language acquisition to proceed is not disputed, because some views or different views have been generated in regard to this positive input. Now, the controversy with regard to this dispute among language researchers is whether positive evidence alone is sufficient for children, especially when they are to master or achieve the mastery of adult grammar. So this positive input is considered insufficient by the opponents of those who feel that the positive input creates or facilitates the language acquisition process. Hence, two theories detailing children's acquisition of syntactic knowledge were introduced. One assumes that children have innate knowledge, and second is the usage-based constructivist theory assumes that the child has no specialized knowledge of language syntax and that everything that he learns comes from his surroundings and from all the caretakers who provide the positive input.